Chapter 4, My New Life. Here's the picture that goes with that. The crows were quiet around their home. This surprised me, as I had always thought of them as noisy birds. That first day in the nest seemed a busy time for them. They both patted me down into the bottom of the nest, which was a framework of twigs and straw. I noticed that they each had mannerisms similar to Emily and Henry. The one who'd found me at the river was definitely the Henry character. The way he'd approached me at the river, first studying from a distance, then coming in for a closer look, always surveying the area before approaching, was just like Henry approaching a tree. Henry never rushed in to fell a tree. He always studied the area to assess the safest direction to have the tree fall. He was very good that way. This crow was just as careful, and he'd flown far from his nest to find me, just as Henry often went far from home to cut timber. The other crow was just as much the Emily character. All through that first day I noticed that I saw much more of that one around the nest. I'll assume that's the lady of the nest. She would fly off, but always come back soon. She spent a lot of time fussing with me, finding exactly how she wanted me to fit in the nest. Several times, when I'd been perfectly comfortable, I was pulled up again by her beak as delicate as Emily with her knitting needles. I decided to call them Ma and Pa Crow. Pa Crow left in the morning, came back to the nest sometime later in the morning, and then would fly off again and return around dusk. He always brought back interesting things. He brought mostly sticks that he would work into the framework of the nest. I could see that each stick had been carefully chosen, uh, a certain length and thickness, just about the same as a size 2 or 3 knitting needle, and all of a certain curve, chosen to fit in a particular part of the nest. There was a wire coat hanger in the nest, too. Ma Crow brought back different things, mostly things that would improve the comfort of the nest. She brought back several tufts of dried grass and matted them down beside me in the places where my wool did not reach. She also brought pieces of dried cattail heads, which, having stood through winter, now unpacked into a bedding of downy fluff. She spread it with her beak and feet and nestled into it, uh, uh, nestled in it to mat it down. After several days, one morning I awoke in the pre-dawn gray to a strange warmth. Ma and Pa Crow were awake. Ma Crow shifted from side to side, apparently trying to get comfortable. Pa Crow nestled beside her, enduring the scratchy sticks. Their beaks clacked softly as they comforted each other. When dawn broke, Pa Crow stood and let out a caw that echoed through the forest. He stood proudly on the edge of the nest, while Ma Crow nestled tightly to me. Pa let out another caw. This was answered in the distance with a kind of gentle gurgling sound. Then the distant crow also cawed, apparently relaying the message. The distant crow arrived at a nearby treetop. It looked younger, shiny black, with neat, unruffled feathers. Soon 3 more crows arrived at nearby trees. They hopped from one treetop to the next until they were close. The first one hopped down to the nest and was greeted by Pa Crow with a low guttural sound akin to human speech. The others gathered close enough to see. Then Ma Crow stood and stepped aside, revealing the source of the mysterious warmth, a single egg. It was oblong, tan with dark spots. Ma Crow rolled the egg to show it off and quickly got back into her position on the egg. The other crows must have been her children from previous years. Indeed, as the weeks passed, those younger crows often came by to help with the nest chores and sometimes brought food. Each of the next 4 mornings found another egg added to the clutch. In the end, there were 5 eggs. In due time, they all hatched, and I beheld the creation of a crow family for the first time. So here's the baby crows. When they first hatched, the babies looked nothing like their parents. Their eyes were tightly shut, and they had no feathers, just wrinkled dark skin. Ma Crow meticulously cleaned the nest. All fragments of eggshell, turds, and such were carried off, and the nest was always kept clean. What with the fresh air and sunshine and the tidiness of Ma and Pa Crow, the contrast between this life and my life on Henry's foul foot couldn't have been more stark. The babies grew quickly. After a week, they were covered with dark gray down. Ma Crow spent most of the time at the nest, leaving only occasionally for short times. She would arrive back with a beetle, a worm, or a caterpillar. The babies fought to snatch the food out of their mother's beak, and as the days passed, I began to recognize each of their personalities. This surprised me, as in my previous life I had heard the sounds of the forest. Even through Henry's boot, I could hear the calls of birds, the howls of coyotes. I even heard the bellowing of a moose once. I never saw these things naturally, but I'd learned to listen to what Henry and the other loggers said, and in that way formed an imaginary picture of what those things must look like. The loggers had always spoken highly of crows. Raymond Bigwood once told a story while they were camping. It was that time when we'd been dunked in the beaver pond, when Henry had been pulled out with the winch, and my partner and I were drying beside the campfire. There at night, by the fire, Bigwood told the story of old Dudley Goss, who'd had a pet crow when he was a child. His mother had climbed a tree to a crow's nest and taken one of the babies. She'd given it to the young Dudley, and he raised it. Bigwood said that the crow bonded with Dudley and became his lifelong friend. It even learned to talk. The crow would fly along as Dudley rode his bicycle to school. One day, a teacher had heard that Dudley had a pet crow that talked, and she'd asked Dudley if he could bring it to school someday so the other kids could see it. And here's the picture that goes along with that. This is also the cover picture, but there's the 2 socks drying by the fire. So Dudley told her that the crow was just outside. He could call it to the window right then and there. He went to the window, called, and the crow came to his arm. It walked up to Dudley's shoulder, and he brought it into the classroom. Then the crow started cussing all kinds of swear words, much to the kids' delight and to the teacher's embarrassment. But I digress. Seeing the baby crows and recognizing their individual personalities surprised me in the degree to which they differed from each other. I'd heard the loggers speak of the crows as if they all shared the same traits, but these were each individuals. One of the young birds was large and strong, but was very calm-spirited. The most aggressive and noisy one was the smallest and weakest. Ma Crow sometimes took care to feed that one directly, letting the others fight over the scraps of food that were delivered to the nest. Another surprise was that in addition to Ma and Pa Crow's grown offspring helping out, other unrelated crows would sometimes bring food to the nest. Crows are very neighborly birds, I learned. I also learned that crows live in great fear of two other kinds of birds, owls and peregrine falcons. Once an owl came near the nest, and many of those same other crows crowded around the owl, flying so as to annoy it and lure it away from the nest. I could see the fright in Ma Crow by the way she knelt close and spread her wings over her young, but nothing came of it. As the young crows grew, and as I heard Ma and Pa Crow instructing them on the necessary lessons of life, I came to understand their language. The loud cawing is used for announcements to the whole community. For more intimate communication, the vocabulary is conveyed in a series of clicks and gurgles with changing rhythm and is capable of subtle articulation and nuance. Mostly, the parents warned of dangers and instructed on how and where to find food. But sometimes they chatted about things they looked forward to, especially the great fall gathering. After the babies have fledged, the crows form a group and fly from place to place. Everywhere they go, more and more crows join, and sometimes the group grows to tremendous numbers. The whole group flies across the land, going wherever desire takes them. It happens every year. Then in late winter, it all breaks up and all the crows return to rebuild their nests and raise the next brood of chicks. That's how crow life goes. As the young ones learned to communicate, they carried on about all manner of topics, including making up names for the different times of day and kinds of weather. One interesting thing I learned from all of this chatter was that those youthful-looking crows who had come when Pa had cawed that morning of the first egg were indeed the sons and daughters of Ma and Pa from the previous 2 seasons, just as I had suspected. They had not yet found mates, and so still lived in the area and would help out Ma and Pa until they had their own families to raise. I had never been curious about the lives of crows, and found myself amazed at what wonderful creatures they are. I never would have come to learn this had I not escaped. And I realized that in escaping, I had cast myself into a fate determined only by random chance. The odds of my ending up here in this good place were infinitesimal. I know that. That's the end of chapter 4.